Today in New York City started the 4th tournament for Levy Rosman, aka Gothamchess, since his return to competitive chess. This is a round-robin tournament, closed event with 10 invited players, 3 grandmasters, giving a chance for the GM title seekers as Levy himself to get the so-called GM norm. So Levy needs 7 points out of 9 in this tournament to get his very first GM norm. In round 1, he played against the top-seeded player, the 3-time Uzbeki champion Djurabek Khamrakulov with the white color. So let's walk through the game and address some of the key moments. So Levy opted with c4, and in our game prep, we mainly expected that e5 will happen because this is what Khamrakulov would mainly play against the English opening. e6 was still part of the prep because Djurabek really likes the idea to play e6, d5, knight f6, the queen's gambit declined, and then at some point play b6 and bishop b7. So what happened here is that Levy played knight c3, d5, and e3. Now, after e3, we are getting to a rather offbeat line because here white refrains from playing d4. So one of the key ideas here is that after b3 and bishop b2, and bishop b2, white positions the bishop on the long diagonal and refrains from putting the pawn on d4 because there are some lines when you actually want to keep this diagonal open. So black played b6, and this is typically the moment when white wants to take on d5. Why here and why not the move before? Because after c takes on d5 and e takes on d5, black would not play b6 anymore. Black would just play c6, have a healthy pawn structure at the queen side, and then proceed something like bishop g4. So as soon as here Khamrakulov played b6, according to the prep, c takes on d5 was the way to continue. And now comes the smart move g3. Now that's a move that I really like, because traditionally here white would play something like bishop b2, would play d4 and something like bishop d3. So black is going to play at some point most likely c5. And as you can see, if white ever wants to take on c5 and try to fight against these hanging pawns as potential targets, the bishop on d3 doesn't really do much. That's why here Levy's idea was to position the bishop from the start on g2. If black indeed is going to play c5, then after d takes and b takes, the bishop on g2 immediately applies some pressure against the black center. So bishop b7, bishop g2, this was played. All of this is pretty standard. Maybe I'll mention here that a6 is a pretty nice move because black is afraid of knight b5 and you don't really want to give up your ducks for bishop just like that for no good reason. So bishop b2, castles, rook c1, rook e8. So this part of the game, the players played out pretty quickly. So Levy had spent about 10 minutes for the first 11 moves. Also, the next move Levy played pretty quickly, rook e1. I really like this move because he kept all the opportunities on the table, moves like d3 and e4. And this is where Khamrakulov decided to force matters. He played knight e5 with the idea to hint that knight e3 might happen on the board. So Levy correctly estimated that the trade is inevitable. He took on e5, bishop e5, and now, during the commentary, I was expecting that Levy is going to play knight a4, try to trade off the bishops with the idea to meet bishop b2, knight b2 with d4, fix this bishop as a bad bishop, and then somehow try to apply some pressure at the queen side. Okay, maybe black would reject it and play something like bishop d6, and now I'm not sure how to continue. I was suggesting maybe queen f3, hitting the bishop on f6, trying to create some weaknesses. But again, the game could continue something like knight e7 and maybe the knight goes back. Would have been a completely different game. What Levy played also made sense. He played queen c2, and I thought that his idea was to play knight e2. Same idea again. You cannot really retreat with the bishop because he wants to take on f6. And if nothing dramatic happens, for example, bishop b2, queen b2, and black plays c5, now you play d4, you want to take on c5, play rook d1, knight f4, and apply pressure against the pawn on d5. However, Levy had different ideas. He played f4. Initially, I was not sure how to evaluate this move, but the more I was looking at this, the more I started to like it. So obviously, bishop c3 is not a good move, because here white could just play a simple move, bishop c3 or queen c3. I'm not sure which is better, but the point is, black has nothing to show for this strong dark square bishop that controls the long diagonal. That's why obviously Khamrakulov retreated with the bishop back on d6, bishop d6, knight e2. This was Levy's idea, hit the knight on f6, and I think that mainly he expected that knight e4 will happen, d3, knight c5, knight e4, what just has a very interesting game. Maybe also e4, e5 suddenly becomes a possibility. Now suddenly here, Uzbekistan Grandmaster surprised Levy and played c5, stopping knight e4, but also allowing bishop takes on f6. Now, naturally, bishop f6 has to be played, otherwise, why did White even go for this position? So White immediately creates some weaknesses in Black's camp, and this is the moment where I think Levy could have used a bit more time. As you can see, he already had a pretty significant lead on the clock, 50-minute advantage, 1 hour and 3 minutes versus 48, and unfortunately here he played it too quickly. He played knight c3 in something like 5 minutes. I think if he had formulated himself that the knight belongs to the king's side, since there are some weaknesses, he would have figured out that the best square to position it is f5. You get to f5 through h4, you get to h4 through f3. Well, and that follows the logic, you get to f3 through g1. Actually, that's why king f2 was the best move here. King f2 with the idea to play, for example, knight g1, which enables not only knight f3, knight h4, knight f5, but also bishop h3. So the game would have been pretty unbalanced, but I think this would have given Levy the better chances. Now instead Levy went for the obvious target, knight c3, hitting the pawn, and after bishop f8, I think he simply struggled with a follow-up. Now the point is, I was suggesting during the broadcast knight a4, hitting these weaknesses here, and maybe toy with the ideas of something like d4. For example, queen e6, d4, Black actually cannot take these two rooks for the queen because the white queen feels to be stronger than those two rooks. The bishops are pretty useless, and also on top of that, Black has multiple weaknesses. But the problem is that after d4, Black can just play rook c8, and it's quite difficult for Black to come up with the next move, because you cannot really take on c5. Black just plays b5 and bishop c5, and then starts to open up the position, and the pawn on e3 becomes a serious liability. Now, maybe that's the reason why Levy decided to play e4. I didn't really like this move because I think he should have felt here that the king is in danger, so opening it up with a dark square bishop on the board was a very risky choice. And now after d takes on e4, I think this is the moment when Levy realized that something is wrong. So I assume he was about here, he was ready to play something like bishop takes on e4, and he just realized that after the trade, Black can just play bishop g7. His idea is to play f5, bishop d4, and if somebody's better here, it's only Black. And why is this? Because the pawn on d2 is more vulnerable than the pawn on f5. I mean, you cannot target the pawn on f5, but the pawn on d2 you can. And the position is pretty open, where Black enjoys a very powerful dark square bishop. So Levy really had to gather the courage here, and he spent something like 15 minutes trying to calm down. And finally he took on e4, and then came the next surprise, c4. I think he actually missed this, because now Black, instead of bishop e4 and bishop g7, he simply opted for bishop c5. And the problem is there's so many tactical problems for White. For example, White takes the pawn on c4. Now the problem here is bishop c5 check, king g2, and rook e4. Now you see Black plays f5, completely exposes the white king. Two bishops versus an exposed king is an easy victory for Black. And also there's no king f1 because there's always queen h3 check, and that's it. It's simply game over for White. That's why he, after c4, Levy again spent a lot of time. He did pick up the best defense, bishop b7. Black responded with a very accurate in-between move, bishop c5 check, because after queen b7, White simply would play knight e4, take away the c5 square, also threaten to give a check on f6, b takes on c4, knight f2, and still White just feels pretty safe. So bishop c5 is an important intermezzo move, and the point is, after king g2, the queen collects the bishop with a check. Levy was also considering king f1 for a moment, but tactically he fails, because after queen b7, knight e4, Black simply plays bishop d4, and f5 seems to be a killing shot. For example, b takes on c4, Black is just dominating, f5, knight f2, queen f3, hitting here the knight on f2 with a mate. And after d3, the problem is, even though white is not like immediately losing, white is completely paralyzed. It's just very difficult to make the next move. For example, you play h5, rook e8, rook e8, rook e1, rook e1, king e1, queen g2, queen g1, everything just starts to fall apart. This bishop on d4, even though white is up a pawn, is clearly dominating the position. The knight on f2 is just a bystander. So that's why Levy did feel that the correct move is king g2, queen takes on b7 and king h3. This was the best defense. Again, you cannot play knight e4 because there's a 5. And after king h3, queen d7, again, Levy found the best move. He played a 5. He correctly estimated that after king g2, there's going to be problems with f5. f5 would limit the knight on c3, thinking about moves like, I think I forgot to include c takes on b takes and f5. There would be problems with queen c6, rook e6, and rook h6. This king is endangered. The knight on c3 has problems to find a good square. That's why here he played the correct move f5, which enables the e4 square for the knight. Takes, takes. And here it was Khamrakulov's time to make a mistake. So he played rook d8, hitting the pawn on d2, very obvious move, but it's also inaccuracy. So the correct move was to take on e1 first, give up the e file, and only now play rook d8. Because now white can't play knight e4, it just hangs the pawn on f5 with a check. So instead, here the Uzbekistan player played rook d8, he missed Levy's great response, rook e8, and now the point is, after rook f1, the pawn on d2 is not under attack, and white just wants to play knight e4 and d3 and consolidate the position. So here after bishop d4, queen d3, suddenly the position was pretty level. Levy was starting to feel pretty confident, and maybe he relaxed a bit too early because it already could be felt that white is having no real issues here. The pawn on a6 is under attack, and here Djurabek played a5. Now during the broadcast I was suggesting why not knight b5, immediately hitting the bishop here with the idea that if black plays rook d8, white could play rook c1, and now the obvious bishop c5 hitting the queen and the pawn actually would be a mistake. Takes, takes, white can play d4, and now you're going to take on d4 because of the spin, white would simply win a piece. So the game could continue until like bishop b4, rook c6, rook d5, rook b6, rook f5, white is slightly pushing, but probably the game is still level. I mean, okay, seriously, black doesn't really have to play bishop c5. Black could just play king g7, rook c7, so the position still remains level, and most likely, with the perfect play, somehow this should fizzle out to a draw. So what happened here is that Levy, from this moment, started to go completely wrong. I don't know what happened here. He played a very strange move, rook f4. Black defended the only move, rook d8. Now he gave a check on g4. Going for checkmate or something, I don't really know. Now he played queen f3, hoping for some kings at attack, but it was simply not meant to be because black is simply too active with the bishop on e5. Also, queen d2 is a threat. Now Levy played knight e4, defending the pawn. Queen d3 became a problem. As you can see, white has simply no attack. He's threatening, black is threatening to trade the queens and get to the pawn on b3. And from here, everything just started to go downhill very quickly. h5 was a great move by Djurabek, hitting the rook which protects the knight. Rook h4, rook d4, and that's it. It's already impossible to defend everything. If the queen leaves the d1 square, the pawn on b3 is lost. So Levy attempted to complicate matters just to give a check or something. Khamrakulov just collected the knight, and after rook h5, king g7, that's it. There was nothing to be done. There's no attack, there's no queen g4, there's no queen c8. After queen c8, only chance maybe for white, this is simply mate in one on the board. So the game ended with a loss for Levy, which is quite unfortunate. Not really a great way to start the tournament, but it's also not end of the world. Losses are definitely going to be part of the road to the Grandmaster title. Levy is just starting his road, and the tournament in New York City is only starting up. This was only round 1, so Levy now needs 7 points out of 8 to get the GM norm, or at least rack up some rating points. So it's a small setback, but again, lessons will be learned. So if you want to follow the action live and see how Levy is doing in his round 2 game, you're going to have to come back the next day at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time or 6 p.m. Central European Summer Time. I'll be doing the commentary on Levy's Twitch and YouTube channels. and you can ask your questions and follow Levy's actions live. Thank you for watching.